Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out on a rainy afternoon to this panel on Sabbath as gift and command, Jewish and Christian perspectives. I want to welcome both those of you here in person and those of you joining us on Zoom. I am Dr. Daniel Jocelyn Simatowski, the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And it's my pleasure to have three panelists here today to discuss Sabbath. And I'd like to introduce them in order here. First, we have Susannah Heschel, who is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on the Wissenschaft des Judentums, and she has used feminist, post-colonial, and critical race theoretical models in interpreting Jewish-Christian relations. A prolific author, she has two forthcoming books. The first written with Sarah Imhoff on Jewish Studies and the Woman Question. And the second is New Paths, Essays in Honor of Professor Elliot Wolfson, co-edited with Glenn Diner and Shaul Magid. Widely recognized for her contributions to Jewish studies and Jewish-Christian relations, Susannah is also a good friend and supporter of the center. Thank you for being here. Next is Joanna Kline, who is an assistant professor of biblical studies at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts, my alma mater. She received her MDiv from Harvard Divinity School and her PhD in Hebrew Bible from Harvard University. Her interests include narrative analogy in the Hebrew Bible, biblical wisdom literature, and ancient Jewish and Christian biblical interpretation. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Intimations of Jacob, Joseph, and Judah in the Stories of King David. Thank you for traveling down to be with us. And finally, my colleague Brian Robinette, an associate professor of theology at Boston College. He received his bachelor's from Belmont, his MA from St. John's University, and his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. His research interests include mystical theology, contemplative practice, Trinitarian theology, and theologies of creation. His most recent publication is The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, and Contemplation. Thank you for being here. And so as we convened in conversation about this panel over the past couple of months, we discerned we wanted to gather to offer reflections and conversation about what keeping the Sabbath means across Jewish and Christian traditions. So I'd like to start with inviting each of you to say something briefly about your own contact with or experience of observing the Sabbath from within your own tradition. And Susannah, perhaps if you could offer some thoughts first.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. I appreciate this conversation. And I'm so glad to be here at Boston College and to be with Joanna and Brian. I also want to thank Shira for organizing everything. Thank you, Shira, and of course my good friend and colleague Ruth Langer. I approached Dan about this panel because I felt that a lot has been written lately about the Sabbath, and some of it I find a little bit disturbing, or what should I say, I think it misses the mark. Why? You might have seen some things even in the New York Times. There was somebody who said that after COVID, she wanted to be with friends, so she had a Sabbath meal at her home, and she would invite 40 people, 60 people, Friday night for a Shabbat dinner. But sometimes she said, well, you know, she's busy Friday, and so she would have it on Wednesday instead. What bothers me about that is simply that the Sabbath isn't something we create, it's something we receive. The Sabbath comes to us, and she didn't understand that. There was something else. It was also the New York Times, where somebody was complaining at some length about having to turn off computers, and you can't work, you can't carry money, you can't have children's electronic toys and so forth. It seemed all the negatives were coming out and not the positives. So that's why I asked Dan if we could talk about the Sabbath. And I think it's especially important for us to talk about it in Jewish Christian circles, because I think both Jews and Christians bring very important insights and experiences to understanding the Sabbath. I'll just say finally, I grew up in a religious Jewish home. Of course, we observe the Sabbath. The Sabbath was and remains for me the anchor of the week. It's that which I anticipate, I look forward to. It's the pinnacle, the peak experience of my week. My week is organized around it. If I see some wonderful fruit in the store, I buy it and save it for the Sabbath. There is an anticipation. It's a time of rejoicing. And I think sometimes that rejoicing may be misunderstood when I hear the Sabbath referred to as a day of wellness, a kind of spa. It's not that. And I think we've gotten a little too much enmeshed in that language of wellness. The Sabbath is also a challenge, but the Sabbath is also an extraordinary opportunity and a gift. This book that Dan has here, The Sabbath, was written by my father. And he has in here some wonderful traditions within Judaism understanding the Sabbath. And I hope we can talk further about some of those traditions in our conversation today.
So coming from the evangelical side of the Christian tradition, there's a lot of variation in how evangelicals understand the Sabbath, observe Sabbath, and also just, I think, a lot of confusion among people about what they're supposed to think or do on what they might call the Sabbath on Sunday for most Christians. And when I was growing up, Sunday for us was a day that was set apart, definitely. We dressed up. I wore clothes that I wouldn't wear the rest of the week, more dressy, and we went to church for Sunday school hour, for church, the church service. Then we went to my grandparents' house and had a family dinner with my cousins. And then usually in the evening, we went back to church for another church service. So most of the day was set apart as a day of worship. And as I got older, though, I definitely did homework. Sometimes I went to the mall, which my mom didn't love, but she permitted. And I think that's common for many in the evangelical world, that the Sabbath, maybe in past times, was a day to go to church, to be with family, and stores were closed and people didn't do sports. But as culture has changed and everything's open and a lot of people play sports, it has lost a lot of those practices that have been in place for the past few generations, at least in America. And I would say among my students today, most of them don't see a whole lot of significance to Sunday or to Sabbath keeping. For most of them, Sunday means you go to church, probably, and then you kind of do what you want for the rest of the day. It might mean you do something relaxing or something fun for yourself, but there aren't really any rules. But there's a lot of variation among evangelicals because there isn't a consistent practice. So but for most people, they don't really know if they're supposed to be observing the Sabbath or what it is, and kind of going to church is the baseline, I would say. But in some of the newer literature coming out of evangelicalism that is focused on things like spiritual disciplines, there are some things that are in common with what Susannah said about, you have to worship, you have to have Sabbath, but it could be a different day, and some points of connection there, I think. So interesting convergences.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for introducing us, and thank you, Susannah, for prompting this, and thank you, Joanna, for being here in conversation with me. I'm representing, I think, largely the Roman Catholic tradition, although I have to say that I'm a convert. That usually means a few things to people. It's either a good thing or a bad thing. It's usually not a neutral thing. I grew up in an evangelical context. I grew up in the Assemblies of God Church in central Indiana. It was very Pentecostal. And I have to say that the most enriching sense of Sabbath keeping, or what Sunday worship can really be, came from my childhood. The image that I have is when my family, along with about 10 or so other family members, decided to plant a new church. And I reckon I would be 8 or 9 at this point. This would be late 70s, early 80s. And we began to meet in a basement of a home among some of the elders there. All the kids gathered, parents, of course, and a sense of family belonging that, of course, radiated from our immediate family, but very naturally expanded to those who were engaged in this activity of trying to plant a church. We would eventually find a pastor, and the church would be incorporated into the broader context of the Assemblies of God. But for a period of time, we met at a state park, at a pavilion. It was a log cabin, basically. And the preparation for this was quite significant. The night before, of course, Saturday for us was one of extensive preparation. We would get up very early, and everybody had their tasks. And it was usually, the men were responsible for heavy lifting, metal folding chairs and wheeling a piano out in a PA system. And then on the other hand, you could see the women carrying in crock pots, things that are very Midwestern, and put it that way, very Midwestern, 2-liter soda, bottles. But the point was the establishment of a place for us that wasn't usually a house of worship. In fact, it wasn't a house of worship, but we made it that way. It kind of instituted it that way through our preparation and through our presence. And our time there was all day. We had a 2-hour service in the morning, and then we would break, and there would be eating. People would change their clothes. There would be walking around in the trails. There would be a few frisbees, maybe jarts, back in the day when you could still use metal tips on jarts. It's very dangerous, so I wouldn't recommend it. And then we would reconvene in the evening to have another 2-hour service, and then there would be an afterglow. And I have never, I want to say I'm nostalgic about it too much, but I don't think I've ever really been able to have such a penetrating sense of community and a sense of Sabbath as a time marked out from the rest of the week that involved a very communal effort, which also enfolded my immediate family into it. So I know I'll speak more along the lines of some Catholic perspectives, but I really wanted to begin there as my most vivid experience of it, and something that gives me the filter by which I would think about these kinds of questions as they were presented.
Thank you. And that's, I think, sets up nicely this kind of next question I have, which I want to direct first to Joanna, then to Brian, then maybe have Susannah's reflections as well, which is that Sabbath is, obviously now we see a shared connection between Judaism and Christianity, but Sabbath observance is greatly reduced in contemporary Christianity. Might you two offer some reflections on what happened and why we are in this kind of odd state that we are? So Joanna, yeah.
Yeah, to me, it seems to come down to, well, I'm a biblical scholar, so I'll focus on the biblical interpretation part of it, that in a way we share the Sabbath commandment in the Ten Commandments, but also, other Sabbath-related commandments in the Bible. But in Judaism, those are mediated through rabbinic literature. In Christianity, they're mediated through the New Testament and other interpretive literature. And so I think the main difference is that Christians have had so many different types of interpretation of the Sabbath commandment, from understanding it in more of a spiritual sense or allegorical sense and not really applying it on a literal level at all. Or later on, Christians have made the distinction between moral and civil and ceremonial laws. And so sometimes Christians have, and basically only the moral laws are the ones that they need to follow. And so the Sabbath commandment has been sometimes understood as a moral commandment, sometimes as a mix of moral and ceremonial, and usually that is interpreted as the ceremonial aspect is the day and some of the rules around the day. The moral aspect is we still do need a day to worship God, but for most Christians that has changed to Sunday. Not all Christians. Some people see the commandment as totally fulfilled in Christ, and that Christ ushers in this Sabbath rest. And so that's another way of not interpreting it as literally applying to Christians. And so I think there's a kind of baked in maybe tension in at least Protestantism and evangelicalism in trying to understand what the Sabbath means for Christians. And so a lot of what I think we have in kind of American Sabbath observance in the past came out of Puritanism, especially, but that wasn't always the way that Christians observed the Sabbath. And so there's just various understandings of how and if those commandments apply. If it applies, is it on a particular day? If it applies, does it involve mostly worshiping? Is that the main point? Or does it involve rest? And if it involves rest, then what does rest look like? And Christians don't have the same kind of interpretations as Jews do, laying out what is rest and what's not rest. We just don't have that. And I think that leads to a lot of the disagreements about, and so I think Christianity maybe is more apt to be shaped by cultural trends because of those tensions.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add a few words to that. I mean, first, I'd like to make a point really clear is that your account, of course, is quite correct, that there's been a great diminishment in terms of the sense of rest among Christians. And there is a diverse expression of how Sabbath or Sunday is understood and expressed. But overall, there is a huge opportunity here. And one of the reasons why I really like the idea of this panel as a Christian and a theologian is the singular opportunity that comes when really thinking about what Sabbath is, what it can mean, and how that can be a source of enrichment for Christians and not one of amnesia. I think, there's so much that one could say about kind of a genealogy of how Sabbath or Sunday worship has changed in Christianity. I think you do have to, of course, look at some of the ambiguity in the New Testament period itself. It's very clear that the earliest Christians had this overwhelming sense of a new thing happening in Jesus. And it was a sense of, as the New Testament literature variously puts it, a sense of new creation. That doesn't mean the rejection of anything, the abrogation of anything, but the sense of a new potent realization of something in our history, God doing something, and for all people. Now, the enthusiasm and the energy around that led to lots of different kinds of shifts in the sense of practice and also the time when one would practice. And it's not unambiguous in the New Testament or the early church, but the broad picture is that there is a shift from Sabbath to Sunday, and which was sort of regarded as the Lord's Day. It's a phrase that comes from the book of Revelation. The Lord's Day is the day when Christians recount the story of Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, interpret scripture, preach, enact certain liturgical or what we call sacramental practices. So there is a kind of temporal shift, you could say. But then there's also ongoing discussion, which is clearly unsettled to this day, about to what extent do Jewish practices and ethos apply to Christians and under what circumstance. Basically, the difficulty of the continuity and discontinuity. And this is a bigger question and something I'm unqualified to answer, but in terms of just law, Jewish law, what is the role of Jewish law in Christian life? And so you'll see in somebody like St. Paul, a convert, say, presumably he was someone who honored the Sabbath and practiced it. But for those who were Gentiles and drawn to this faith, his basic approach was to allow for a certain kind of discretion in terms of how observances were observed. So for those, as he puts it in various places, like in Romans or in Galatians, that it's a matter of personal conscience and that it shouldn't be a source of disunity between followers of Jesus, how they choose, whether they choose to follow the law or certain aspects of the law and those who don't. So I think that some of that tension of continuity and discontinuity is really early, and it extends throughout. Within the first three, as far as I can gather, and what I've read about the first 3 centuries of Christian practice, the practice of Sunday worship did not emphasize rest. It wasn't a dominant theme. It would become more of a theme around in the 4th century. But there was both a sense of the novelty or the newness around what Christians were experiencing after the resurrection. But I think we also have to point out that there was an effort to try to distinguish from Jewish practice. And I think that that is a problematic thing, a kind of cutting off of vital resources in the effort to distinguish, well, we don't do that, we do something else. And I think that one could talk about other things in subsequent history, but I'll kind of bring my particular contribution to this question to a close, which is to say, I do think it's unsettled for a lot of Christians in terms of how Sunday observance ought to go. There are a lot of different local, individual, denominational approaches to that. But again, the whole point of Sunday worship and the intelligibility of what Christians celebrate really extends from the Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. And so Sabbath practice is a way, I think, to listen in an interfaith learning, but also to enrich Christian practice.
Susannah, what are you hearing in these reflections here?
Well, first of all, I would say what I find odd is that the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. So to walk away from one of the 10 commandments is rather striking. Why would that happen? Why would Christians do that? What we learn from historians is that early on, the first 3 centuries, of course, there were Jews who believed Jesus was in some way the Messiah, but who also went both to church on Sunday and observed the Sabbath and went to the synagogue. They did both. And apparently there were some Christian leaders, Chrysostom among them, that felt this was not appropriate. It's one or the other. You can't do both. And they condemned it. So I think there's a sociological, we might say, element rather than a theological element that said, let's get rid of those synagogue-going Christians. Sunday is, in fact, not the Sabbath. It's the day of the sun, which is pagan. And it's, of course, the day of the resurrection. But it's never been seen as the Sabbath, but as something different. So in some sense, one could say, well, there's no reason not to have Sunday, the day of the Lord, the day of the resurrection, plus the Sabbath, to have both, in other words. And yes, I actually grew up, my parents were very friendly with Professor W.D. Davies at Union Seminary, and he and his wife and their daughter Rachel observed the Sabbath on Sunday in a very, one might say, in a very serious way. They came from Wales, and this was their practice, like mine, which is we didn't use money, we didn't go shopping, food was prepared ahead of time. It was a day set apart. And for them as well, it was set apart. I guess one of the things that I wonder about is this question of the moral and the legal, and why we talk in those terms. So somehow the observance, Jewish observance of the Sabbath, which does have certain rules around it, is seen as somehow legalistic and not moral. But on the other hand, I think, moral principles, morality has laws. Don't we know that? And certain laws of behavior are in fact moral. So the idea that the moral and the legal are somehow opposite, it doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, every church has certain rules, right? And every society and every human being, we have rules of how we're going to behave. All right, so in that sense, but then part of what's then associated is sort of Jews observe the Sabbath in this strict way, and they don't do these things, and it's really hard. And then I think, well, we're losing the other element here, which is, and you brought this up, rest, menucha, rest, which isn't something that means you don't do it. In other words, rest is not the negation of action. Rest is something special in itself. Mm-hmm. I just mentioned, I know everybody knows Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. You know, he leads me beside the still waters. You know that verse. What are the still waters? Those are the waters of menucha, of rest. Stillness, that's something different. And I think anybody, and I would say especially here at Boston College, at a Catholic institution, you understand what stillness means. It has a meaning in Catholic spiritual tradition, stillness. So I think we need to also think about what the Sabbath has meant, how it's been understood. For example, and I'll end with this, as a foretaste of paradise. What does it mean to create for ourselves a day that would be a foretaste of paradise? And I have to say, I wonder how many people today even think about paradise. We have a long tradition, religious traditions, Christians and Jews, of paradise, but we don't think much about it, or long for paradise, or long for a taste of paradise. And yet that is one aspect of the Sabbath, a taste of paradise. What would that experience, how can we create that experience for ourselves? Or I might say, why would we deprive ourselves of that experience? Life is short. Why not experience a foretaste of paradise? And then we can ask, well, how do we do that?
Would either of you like to pick up on some of that?
Sure. Happy to do. Well, thank you. One of the things that prompts in me, as a theologian, is also, what does it mean about God that this is a commandment? Rest. And this is a radical understanding, actually. Namely, that God, of course, is creative and active. So there can be no, in any Jewish or Christian understanding, God as some kind of deistic watchmaker, just simply stands apart and, kind of gets things in motion and observes and maybe occasionally takes a thought about it here or there. But rather, God is creator and God is active. So act is essential. But then the profound understanding that God rests and that creation just isn't simply something that God works on, or it's a big kind of mechanical enterprise in which we're cogs in, kind of like a machine, but rather God rests. What does that mean? Certainly it doesn't mean that God got exhausted. It means that God takes delight in creation. Resting isn't just, but it's delight and joy and festivity. And it's also a deep understanding of the source and ground of all reality as letting be creation in its integrity, that it's good and that it's holy, it's made sanctified. And so there's delight. I mean, it sounds almost too much to say about God, but I think it's very appropriate that God's rest is delight or enjoyment of creation. And so when we rest, it's not about a cessation of otherwise frenetic activity, but it's actually a participation in God's own rest. And it's also an expression of what creation is really about, which of course involves activity and strain and building, etc., but also, and more fundamentally, about an openness and an enjoyment of what is the case. So there's something that's very aesthetic, in terms of the beauty and the delight and the joy of creation. So this is a very, Sabbath, talk of Sabbath or Sunday worship has to really reflect on, well, who is this God we're talking about? What is the nature of this God? We may not be able to know the nature of God as a kind of essence, but this communicates something very powerful about who God is and who God is in relationship to us. And so Sabbath is a participation in that. And that's well beyond anything like just simply wellness, even though some of that can be appropriately a part of the package.
I do think for maybe the minority of Protestants who are thinking more deeply about Sabbath or practicing Sabbath in various ways, there has been a kind of return, and probably under the influence of Jewish practices, to the idea of joy and the Sabbath as a gift, the Sabbath as a celebration. And I think part of it is from the influence of wellness culture, and just the realization maybe what brought people to Sabbath practice might be the realization that modern life is really unhealthy. And so there is a kind of a big dose of wellness culture kind of in some of the writing that I've read on the Sabbath from evangelicalism. But there's also a influence, as I said, from Judaism in terms of understanding it as joy and not as restriction. So I think that actually is a trend.
Yeah. In that sense of the notion of where time is sitting with all this is another kind of aspect. So we're talking about creation, rest, and then time is set up here. And in the book, The Sabbath, time is a real piece of how Abraham Joshua Heschel was thinking about this. So in one of the later chapters of The Sabbath, Heschel brings up the image of the Sabbath as a queen who's welcomed at the Kabbalat Shabbat to alert us to the fact that the Sabbath is, as he says, a spirit. That's a reality that we meet rather than an empty span of time, which we choose to set aside for comfort or recuperation. So one thing to think about here is how sacred time itself is being experienced. And so sacred time is experienced in lots of different ways in both the Jewish and Christian traditions. So how is Sabbath keeping or other parallel practices that may or may not be Sabbath, say in Christian traditions, open us up to different experiences of time itself? And I don't know if this is sort of an open question. Anyone can jump off here. But what are we learning about time also in our respective traditions?
Let me just say that the idea of the Sabbath as a queen or bride who comes to us is already rabbinic. In other words, the text that's called legalistic is actually quite metaphorical and spiritual. Although I will mention that in his commentary, Rashi changes it to king. So it's always a problem with the female, All right. But I think that's one of the most important elements here that we're talking about, that we think about, and my father talks about this in his book, we tend to think about places that are holy. But he says, no, the Sabbath is about time that is holy. And the question is, how do we make time holy? He says time is life. What is life? A human life is time, so that we take it very, very seriously each moment. How do we make a day holy? That's the question. And he says, some people have cathedrals. Sabbath is a palace in time, not a physical structure. He calls the Sabbath the presence of God. And in fact, the Zohar, Jewish book of mysticism, says the Sabbath is the name of God. I think actually some of these images about both time and more generally about the Sabbath, I find them helpful. And I'll just mention, on the Sabbath, we receive an additional soul. because the experience is so profound of the Sabbath. We need an extra soul. We're given an extra soul to experience the Sabbath. And what is that soul? It comes from Moses in one commentary. The soul of Moses comes to us on the Sabbath. And at the end of the Sabbath, that additional soul goes back up to heaven, and God asks the soul, "What was your experience on this Sabbath?" Which then suggests to us that we cultivate something on the Sabbath, cultivate something that then goes back to God as a gift to God, that God receives that gift. There's also a teaching that on the Sabbath, it's as if we're standing in Mount Sinai about to receive the Ten Commandments, the Torah. And that's also something I find very profound and stimulating to think about. I would imagine, for example, Sunday, I don't know, it's the day of resurrection. There are those Christians who think about what would it be like to stand at the foot of the cross. So these are, I find, very important, suggestive ideas. And they're suggestive, which is important. It's not spelled out, but it's for us to imbibe and experience each in our own way. But yes, it's a day that also comes to us. That's how we started today. It comes to us. It's not Wednesday. And it comes as the sun is beginning to set. And it ends 25 hours later when it's dark. So there's an attentiveness to the world, to creation, what's happening. The sun is about to set. In my home, we would kindle the Sabbath, light the candles, and then go into the living room where we had a window that faced west, and we could watch the sun set. And that was beautiful and wonderful. We sometimes lose the connection to the way time is formed by nature. And the Sabbath is part of that nature. And that I find also wonderful. And when the sun begins to set, the Sabbath comes, and that means that all the busyness of the day, all the preparations, all the cooking, it ends at that moment. At that moment, you light the candles and welcome the Sabbath. And I find that also extremely important. Anticipation, preparation, and knowing, yes, now the Sabbath has come to me. It's not that I say, well, when I'm finished cooking in half an hour, then I'll make the Sabbath. There's a big difference. And why would we deprive ourselves of that experience? It's a wonderful experience.
So thinking in parallel, like what about time and Christianity are we learning about here?
If I may, I'll get to that, but I still want to linger with these words directly, and with also this text that your father wrote, and I've enjoyed and actually had my students read last year. I think one of my students is here who read that text last year in a core course. But this business about time is so important, and I think that kind of in a similar way, we tend to think of time as spatialized. And so time in this flattened sense is it's like chronological, it's chronos time. It's one thing after another. And so time is not our friend here. It's actually this kind of, almost mechanical, pulsing, you have to get things done. You have to, buy time, or you're here to kill time. I mean, think of the metaphors we use in our language with respect to time. We got to manage it. We got to buy it. We got to kill it. We're running out of it. And it's kind of going on. And again, it almost has like this clockwork aspect. It's chronos. It's a chronological time. But what your father is pointing to and what you're pointing to here is a deeper dimension of time, or a higher time, which is not just one thing after another, but is a qualitative reality. There's a line, I was looking for it, but there's a line in the Sabbath where your father says that it's not so much that we take time for the Sabbath, but we inhabit that time. And so this language of a cathedral of time, or architecture of time in this text is crucial. And there's so much about our modern world that would have us experience time as one thing after another, or as a kind of commodity. And so the practice of Sabbath as a creative intervention into that, but not something that's destructive. It is an interruption, but it's actually an unveiling or an opening up of deeper dimensions of time as lived, as a quality of livingness, as a quality of relationship, and as a quality of holiness. And so we participate in that rather than managing it. And I think that, therefore, concrete practices, it's one thing to just kind of intellectualize this. You can make it sound pretty, but what's the point if you don't actually have your life punctuated by a practice, some sort of ritual practice in which you are not managing it, but you are, in a sense, in relationship with something that is anterior or prior to you, and it has a kind of summons quality. There's another, I think that this is also true in Christian understanding, and I'll just say something very briefly about this, which is that in Christian understanding, it's clearly not the case that even though we experience time as a succession of moments, that there is qualitative time, meaning kind of a sense of the meaning or richness of time, or kairos, the right time, or a fulfillment of time, or you could say a convergence of different kinds of times, overlapping elements. And that is really experienced in those moments of holiness, of celebration. So, Eucharistic celebration, to speak of the Catholic, but not only Catholic, but the Catholic tradition, where in the liturgical flow, there is a suspension of what we ordinarily feel as the kind of the mechanical movement of time, in which it's almost as though all time is present. It's anticipation, it's remembrance. There's also this, ideally, if we're open to it, a nowness to it, like a fullness of now. So it's like it's neither past nor present or only now, but some sort of confluence of this in terms of our relationship to the eternal God. So there's so much to dialogue with traditions here in terms of marking time in a qualitative sense of time rather than succession.
Yeah, I think when I think about time in the Christian calendar, and just on a not such a rich theological level as you just said, thank you, that was beautiful. But just on the liturgical year is the main place that I thought of where Christians who observe it experience different rhythms in time and times that are separate from other times, and especially times like Advent and Lent, where there's different practices that go along with it, fasting or different liturgies, and that it's this time of preparation that's set apart from other kinds of times. But I was also trying to think through what similar practices Christians might have who don't observe the liturgical year. And one that I thought that's a little bit analogous in an evangelical type tradition is just the kind of daily devotions, a kind of daily quiet time that a lot of people take. And I think a lot of people would do that in the morning, and it would be a practice that they are setting aside this time as something different, something before they do anything else in the day, maybe even before they check their phone, which is saying a lot these days. And so setting apart a time where they meet God, they don't get started right away on their to-do list or jumping in the shower or checking phone. So they're meeting God, and it's also something that sets the tone for the rest of the day or affects how they live the rest of the day, which I think is kind of a parallel practice to Sabbath. When you're a Sabbath practicer, that affects the way that you see normal time as well. And so I think for people who practice a kind of daily devotion, they're aiming for that practice to shape the way that they're living their life in the rest of the day as well.
Good, thank you. So a last question, one I developed since we last talked, which is this also is all revolving, talking about Sabbath keeping, other ways of observing time. It's really about sanctification, or making the holy tangibly present in some way. That nowness that you speak of, or this palace of time, these cathedrals of time. So what does making the holy immediate and real, what implications does that have for our respective communities, or what does that offer to our communities that maybe they might need to be awakened to again? So at least speaking for a Christian one, maybe not for a Jewish one, it depends, but what is about that making the holy present that is meaningful for the life of community? Susannah, I'm happy to hear from you first if you want.
Yes, I think we live with it, all of us, in a kind of tension as individuals, with our own lives and our own thoughts, and then with a community, with friends, with a larger community that we need, but sometimes resist, perhaps. But I think the Sabbath is something that's hard to celebrate all alone. It is a day that lends itself to being with people, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I wonder if we might think about the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath, the day, the time, as sanctifying, of course, because that's the commandment, to sanctify. We make the day holy. It doesn't just come to us as holy. When we think about, well, what do I do? How do I bring myself? What do I find inside of myself, in my soul, that can make a day holy? And in that, I'm just reminded of what you were saying earlier, both of you made me think about prayer. Prayer we think of in words, usually. We say a prayer. There's also singing or dancing can be a form of prayer. But there are other ways in which we pray, and certainly in Jewish tradition, there are also physical ways of praying, experiencing. Eating can be a form of prayer, and remember, for most of humanity, food was not readily available. It was something precious. But to eat in a way that can be also a prayer, it gives us life. Walking with a holy person as a form of prayer. But there's a verse in a psalm, and I don't remember the number, but it says, Ani tefillah, I am prayer. What does it mean for the Sabbath as a day to be in itself a prayer? And what does it mean for us observing the Sabbath so that our life itself becomes a prayer? I am a prayer. What do we do to experience that and, in a sense, make our own lives a prayer? So I think that's one of the ways in which the Sabbath makes me think in different terms, that it's not just prayer as words, for example, but prayer, a day becomes a prayer to God.
Thank you.
A couple of thoughts, really reflecting on the first part of what you said, that the holiness of the day doesn't just come to us. I mean, there is a kind of way in which we're summoned to it, so it's prior to us, but we actually make it. And that is also a remarkable insight into the fact that we are co-creators or collaborators in a way with divine creativity. It's not just that human beings are passive recipients to something, but we also are capable, we have a certain kind of agency, set of capacities to be able to make something holy. And so through our actions or through our words. And so you think about the enormous dignity that implies for the human being and for the creature to do that. So, sometimes you hear the word holy and it almost sounds like there's an energy force field that, will zap you and or there's something that is haunting about it or, forbidding. And of course there can be a sense of holiness that involves a deep sense of respect and deference and fear in terms of the proper spiritual sense of that term, the appropriateness of honor and worship. But at the same time, this is something that we are doing as well. We ourselves are enacting this. And so through different gestures, through our senses and through how we work with time, that is a making of something holy or a sanctifying. And again, you just have to ask yourself, what kind of image of the human person does this presuppose? This is far beyond any understanding of the human being as just another functional, thing, a machine, as we were participating in something. The other thing about what it is that, with respect to the original question, is what leapt to mind was the importance of gratitude that's involved in making holy or sanctification. And that is a sense that what one is doing or involved in is something that one can say yes to, but also experience a gratitude for. Say thank you. It's possible to say thank you for this, to receive it as a gift, to say thank you. And I actually think that there's a very deep elemental voice in us that says yes. It's capable of saying yes. And if we become open to that, it says yes almost by itself. But anyway, the practice of gratitude, of saying yes or thank you or I receive this, and that gratitude not just being, boy, am I lucky, more of a thank you, where there's an addressee to what one is thankful for. To God, I thank you. That is, I think, a big part of sanctification.
I think that element of transcendence is something that so many people are looking for today. And the idea that there's something that's more important than just maximizing my own personal pleasure is just something that I think religious communities in general can really help people realize and work towards. And that idea also, like you were saying, of understanding humans as co-creators, not just kind of cogs in a machine, it really is relevant to issues of justice as well, and how we treat others that we're in relationships with or not. And so just a reprioritization of values versus what the normal values that our culture values. I think that tapping into that holiness, that transcendence, can really transform how we see just mundane life as well, and how we treat other people and things that we do to work for justice.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice way of ending our formal panel reflections. We're going to open up conversation to people here in the audience and also people on Zoom. While Shira is walking around with a microphone in the back to find our first question, I just want to note an observation from my colleague Michael Azar of Scranton University in the field of Jewish-Christian relations, who is Orthodox. He does note that in the Orthodox world, the Sabbath itself is marked liturgically. There are specific Vesper prayers or liturgical prayers for the Sabbath day, although a lot of the Sabbath-like practices do occur on Sunday. So thank you, Michael, for that online contribution. So are there any we're going to alternate between in-person and online questions. So anyone might want to comment.
Hi, my name's Carl Racine. I grew up in the evangelical tradition as well, and we went to Sunday school on Sunday morning, and then church, and then a big meal at home, and then back for youth group, and then church in the evening. And when I started studying the Sabbath, one of the things I read was Rabbi Heschel's book, and it blew me away because it gave me a whole different vision. And the first thing made me realize, looking back at the biblical materials, there's nothing in the Bible about Sabbath as a day of worship. The one thing most Christians think of the Sabbath as a day of worship is never mentioned. Why? Because worship happens 7 days a week. The temple had worship going on constantly. Sabbath wasn't set apart as a day of worship, it was set apart as a day of rest, of stopping. And so what I got from Rabbi Heschel's book, along with a lot of wonderful thoughts, was also what Christopher Stendhal calls a holy envy of something in some other religious tradition that you wish your tradition had. Because I see it as an essential aspect of the Sabbath that it be something communal. It defines a community, it shapes a community, it makes a community of holiness, a community that sanctifies the Sabbath. It's not something I can do as an individual. And lots of Christians sort of think, well, I can have a Sabbath on a Thursday and have my own private Sabbath. That's not the same thing. So my frustration as a Christian, and I don't really know, I don't have an answer to this, is how could Christians create a Sabbath community, an experience of the Sabbath that was a community experience and not simply me in my own private prayer room? St. Augustine famously said that Jesus observed the Sabbath. Even in his death, he rested on the Sabbath in the grave and rose to new life on the first day of the week. If Christians could find that kind of paradigm of observing the Sabbath and then finding the new life, the new hope on Sunday, that might be a way of doing it, but I don't have a clue as how you could get Christians to come together and celebrate the Sabbath as a community. So I'm just leaving that as an open question.
So, and just to add a little flavor, there's a similar question online here. I think the deeper question is, where is the line between a Christian observance of Sabbath and how we do it and learn from Judaism, and where does appropriation begin or something negative happen? I know, Susannah, you've had.
I don't feel it's appropriate. I mean, I think sometimes when
You don't think it's
when there's
appropriation?
when there's some Christian communities who want to have a Christian bar mitzvah, I have a problem. But the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. We do share the Bible. I don't see that as an appropriation. I see that as a recognition that the Hebrew Bible is as much a part of divine revelation as is for Christians, as is Christian scripture.
So let me put this on everybody. What one thing from your practice would you advise a Christian to do around Sabbath keeping?
Kindle the Sabbath lights as the sunset begins. To kindle the candles, yeah, and say a prayer. Bless your children.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. Thank
Come
you.
together for a nice dinner.
Do you want to respond to this question of what can we do? How we get Christians to do Sabbath?
I'll just say I've had the exact same questions as I've been thinking through it, and the question of appropriation is one I've thought about. There definitely in a couple books I've read, the authors do kindle the candles. They have Sabbath meal. But then they also, one person has his Sabbath on a Wednesday, and it's a very individualistic practice, and so, yeah. When do those things become appropriation? When is it just authentic, appreciation of the tradition? Because many of the Jewish Sabbath practices are not in the Bible. Kindling the candles, for example. And so, yeah, what can Christians take? And I just have the same questions about that.
Yeah, part of this is, of course, complicated by the fact that just attendance in general, worship services is in decline, and that's a whole other story. But just attendance, or a sense that being a person of faith, that would be something that has inherently communal dimensions to it. This is something that we're unlearning. And so it almost seems extravagant to say, well, what about, Sabbath practices when we're struggling even with participation at a bare minimum. But I think that one thing that I would say in light of a very key point you made is that spiritual practice, there are a lot of people who are pretty comfortable with using the term spirituality or spiritual practice. That hasn't always been the case, but it certainly is the case. And of course, the alternative to that is religious, so I'm spiritual but not religious. And that usually suggests some, understandably, certain kind of prejudices towards institutions, communal life, basically other people, but to be spiritual when other people are involved in that is going to mean community. It's going to mean, it's going to bear upon what we call religious. But if I were to, in light of this issue or this problem, the privatization or the individualization of spirituality and spiritual practice, I think the one thing that I would commend would be that an enrichment of observance would have some relational character. So yes, it would be wonderful to say, engage in practices of joy or engage in practices of gratitude or whatever else. But it might mean really stretching yourself to involve other people. If that means a meal, or if that means thinking about observance that involves reaching out to people, making a practice of reaching out to people that you haven't talked to in a while or who may need some relational energy. I think that a commitment, something relational, I think would be a really important aspect to include into this conversation.
Thank you. Shara, we have someone over here in the middle.
Thank you. I'm a little confused by something that you talked about, and maybe you answered my question, I didn't understand it. But in the Torah, it says Sabbath is the seventh day, and that's our Sabbath being Saturday. I guess maybe it depends on the lunar calendar versus
Can you speak up a little?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now? Sorry. So I'm confused with the Torah. It says the Sabbath is the seventh day, and I know there's a difference in calendars, a lunar calendar versus the other calendar. But if the Sabbath is the seventh day, how did the Sabbath for Christians get to be on Sunday, which is not the last day of the week?
Right. Go ahead.
I'm confused.
I think Joanna is right up on this.
Well, I think it's kind of a complicated question, but as Brian was saying, in the first centuries, it looks like Christians met for some kind of worship on Sunday because that was the day of Jesus' resurrection, but they didn't consider that to be the Sabbath. It was, and maybe some of them did observe the Saturday Sabbath, but it was the day of worship. And then as time went on, so most people cite Constantine decreed in 321 that Sunday would be a day when certain shops would be closed and a day of rest for certain people, although he didn't connect that with worship as far as I understand. But that kind of began a process where Christians had more space in the day to devote to services and things like that, and also not work, which before they probably would have been working. And so then as time goes on, and especially in the context of Jewish-Christian polemics sometimes, there was this idea that, oh yeah, we don't want to be like the Jews observing the Sabbath on Saturday, and so Sunday is our day, and that's kind of a mark of being a Christian. But as I understand it, it wasn't really till sometime later, maybe in an English Reformation context, that really the Sabbath got totally transferred in the Christian thought of some people to Sunday, and they started applying that Sabbath commandment to Sunday, and either saying that the church decided to switch the day, or that just Jesus by his resurrection made that our Sabbath. But at first, Sunday was not considered the Sabbath for Christians, but eventually various sociological and theological factors, it became understood as that.
That's great.
On the flip side, there was a question online asking what happened in non-Orthodox or traditional expressions of Judaism that Sabbath-keeping observance began to look differently. And do you have anything you want to add on that, Susannah, about what are the cultural dynamics there in areas of, say, Reform Judaism or so on?
So one was the period of emancipation, assimilation, integration, and the other is suburbia, which has been a disaster for the Sabbath. You understand why? Because suburbia means that we live in big houses, far apart from neighbors, but not in a condensed way, a lot of people together so that we can walk to a synagogue, walk to our friends' homes, and avoid driving on the Sabbath. And sadly, the conservative movement decided shortly before my father's book was written that it was permissible to drive to the synagogue on the Sabbath. It's one of the reasons my father felt he needed to write this book. Once you drive to the synagogue, you're also going to stop for some gas for the car and maybe get some lunch at a restaurant and maybe pick up something at the mall. And so it falls apart. But it's very hard in suburbia. And then you have a big synagogue and everybody drives there. So that's one problem. Another is actually in Europe and in Germany, and it's true, I think until this day in Germany, you have to work on certain days. You can't get an exemption from your job at the grocery store because it's the Sabbath, or an exemption from taking an exam at the university for the Sabbath. And liberals in Germany think, well, why should we do that? And so I'm very grateful that in the United States, we do have laws that protect religious observance. That's very important. So unfortunately, yes, I think that the so-called liberalization of religion, and I think it's the wrong word anyway, has made us lose so many of the most wonderful elements of religious practice, and that's unfortunate.
We're at time. I wonder if each of you might want to offer a sentence about Sabbath that you're either taking away from this conversation or you want to encourage the audience with. And whoever has an idea first, raise your hand or speak. So what's a takeaway from this?
Well, I think the Sabbath allows us to think in different terms about life. If the Sabbath the whole week is a pilgrimage to the Sabbath. It's an anticipation of what's coming. It's a way of experiencing our lives differently. And I think that's great. I also think it's important for us to keep in mind that the Sabbath is a gift to God, not only to be thought of as a gift to us or something that we create. I also think there's a lot in the Bible, including in the New Testament, about Sabbath observance. Why is there that discussion? Is it permitted to pick the ears of corn on the Sabbath? Well, it's known that there's some things you do and you don't do on the Sabbath. So one didn't have to wait for the Talmud and all of that to know that there's and I think the other element is just the joy. And perhaps one of the important things for, let's just say the Lutherans, to do is to get rid of the juxtaposition of law and gospel, because in fact, having certain ways of doing things, what we may call law, enhances us, and it would enhance, I think, gospel.
I was going to follow up on that. I was going to say that for Christians who maybe don't know a lot, think a lot about Sabbath or associate Sabbath either with kind of legalism and lots of rules in Judaism, or maybe they associate it with past American Christian observance of Sabbath with tons of rules. I would say a really great place to start is with Heschel's book on Sabbath, or try to get invited to a Shabbat dinner. Those are great places for Christians to start who can think of Sabbath as a thing about rules and regulations.
Yeah, right.
I might just select a quote from Sabbath, and I'll just read it. It's page 3 if you have it. But there is a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but be in accord. And the way that sentence structure works is that, yes, there are certain things one shouldn't do or withdraw from doing, but it's really about opening up the possibility of something deeper and richer. So it's not just minus, but it's actually deeply a plus.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for being here and for this conversation. It was very rich. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.